Hello and welcome everyone. I think this is a really special workshop for the History and Development Workshop Group because we're very privileged to have Katharina Pistor with us. As you know, she's a professor at Columbia Law School and she's produced what I think is definitely one of the most important books of the decade, The Code of Capital. She's also done very interesting work on digital currencies. And now, of course, she's, I think, uh, still again on the front lines of research, which is so important for understanding not just the economy, but contemporary capitalism. So we're all really looking forward to this webinar. Katharina, please go ahead, just start. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Jariati, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just share my screen and just walk you through my argument for today. I've somewhat broadened or given you a slightly different perspective in these slides than I have in the paper. The paper is mostly background reading. I'm actually working together with a colleague who is a technologist and an economist on a bigger project, which might still evolve into a book project. We haven't really decided yet, but we have been talking for the last 3 years or so about, the issue of data. And the paper that I sent you is one spin-off project that I did from that. But here's some more background information. And I'm just mentioning here a couple of legal research assistants I had to put some of the information together that you will see here, Kate, Hyun Kyung, and Roxana. So thanks to them as well. What I want to do is to say a little bit how I got to the coding of data and why I'm thinking about this and the way in which I'm thinking about this. I come, of course, from coding law. I want to tell you a little bit about the legal Wild West when it comes to data by showing you how legal institutions, in particular courts, but also regulatory agencies, have conceptualized data. And that's an important data point, an important feature of the system, because it tells us what is protected and what is not protected. So then I will turn to how data is being harvested, used in the economy right now. I'm sort of foreclosing state surveillance. I'm focusing mostly on the economy and want to show you how basically the governance regime that we currently have over data is a mixture of technological prowess and the exploitation of legal gaps. And that then leads me to possible governance solutions moving forward about data, which involves, from my perspective right now, mostly law. I'm hoping that we can learn more about the technology and bringing this together. So I'm not a naive technology optimist, but I think when it comes to data, we also have to harness the frontiers of technological development, and not only what is happening inside the big tech companies, but also what is happening in many smaller ventures where people are thinking more seriously about privacy rights and maybe also collective governance mechanisms. So here, as you know, I wrote this book, which was published already 2 years ago on coding capital. And in the book, I make the case that a capital asset is really made of two elements. It's basically the asset, the resource, the land, the firm, the debt, the know-how, with specific legal modules, as I call them. So you take contract law, property law, collateral law, trust, corporate law, and bankruptcy law, and you graft these legal devices onto different objects, ideas, resources, and promises. And here we go, you have an asset that can produce relatively more wealth over time than assets that do not have this kind of protection. So I'm insisting here on relative. There is no absolute protection, we know that. But relative to everybody else, I'm better off if I have coded my asset in law. So in law, I'm basically focusing mostly on a handful of attributes that you need. You have to have stronger rights than others. They must be more durable, survive longer over time, basically by protecting your assets and interests from too many different creditors. You want to have an agent that enforces these privileges against the world, erga omnes, so others have to yield even if they were not at the table when the deal was made. And then for financial assets, they attain durability effectively by having a convertibility option to flip their assets, especially in times of crisis, into safer assets, typically into cash, which holds its nominal value, which is worth a lot in times of crisis. So I'm not going to walk you through the entire book, but I just wanted to highlight again the key modules here are modules of private law, contract law, property law, collateral, trust, corporate law, and bankruptcy law. And I'll come back to this later on. So what we're witnessing right now when it comes to data is what some people call the third enclosure. So we had the enclosure of land in England in the 16th century, in other countries on continental Europe, perhaps a little later, but we're still enclosing land around the globe. Titling systems that the World Bank and other development agencies are sponsoring are still trying to create individual private property rights that can be used to monetize the value of land. Right? So this is the legal enclosure, and the legal attributes that I mentioned before are all about trying to extract the monetary or monetizable value from an asset. These assets sometimes have an existence outside the legal structure, like land does, but financial assets and copyrights and patents have an existence actually only in the law, which makes them particularly interesting assets. Now, data are different as well, and what we can find, and I'll show you this in a second, is that different social systems, including the legal system, treat data quite differently. And the project that I started with Kopje, my colleague, Kopje Georg, was to first try to understand how law, economics, and technology actually understands what data is and how it can be used. And then the next question is, of course, that comes from the thinking about my book, is whether data is the new capital asset. As you know, the economists called it at some point the new black oil. But the more I thought about this is I felt that this was a far too simplistic approach to understand what data really is and what it can do. So once we create private power over data, we can use it not just as capital. So the data of other people aggregated at a certain level with certain computational power thrown at it can be used to monetize that data, mostly by giving others access to the data for a certain price, or exploiting the data for one's own competitive activities in a marketplace. I don't really like to call it a marketplace because I think it's actually a rather hierarchical, structured exchange relation. But beyond that, the data itself can be used as a means of control or surveillance, as Shoshana Zuboff has called it, because we can, and we know this from social studies, we can use data about groups of people to make predictions even about the behavior of individuals. And we also know that we can target individuals or groups to make them behave in a certain way. So this becomes a powerful means of control. Not that we haven't seen this before. We know, of course, that there has been propaganda before, but I think the extreme negative example that I have, at least in the back of my mind, is something like the Chinese social credit system. And one can easily imagine similar types of systems, even in a capitalist system, exerted by private agents, not only public agents. So this means of control basically can be used against individuals and groups. And I think that's critical for thinking about data in the longer term. And what I'm presenting in the paper, I'm also presenting here today, is somewhat more limited. I'm mostly thinking about the economic uses and the economic gains, but also about the scope of data that private players might have access to. So here is just a few examples about the legal Wild West. So when I sent my research assistant out, I just wanted to know how courts and regulators have conceptualized what data is. And so the legal qualifications of data is difficult, ambiguous. Different courts, different legal systems have developed different approaches. In general, individual rights of the data producers, like you and me who are on this Zoom call or are using any other digital platforms, or even are walking down the street and some cameras are picking up what we're doing, we have relatively limited rights, if at all, to our data under any legal system. So the EU is a little bit ahead of things. California is following up, but in general, it's also only a narrow subset of data that is being protected. Whereas so the individual data producers have little rights, but what is protected and has been protected since the 1980s in the United States is putting aggregate data on a device. Once you have aggregate data and you just basically stole them or took them from wherever they were, they treated them as wild animals, as I suggest in the paper. Once they're on a device, anybody who's hacking onto this device will be treated as if he was a thief. So we don't really call them now property rights, but we treat them as if they were property rights. And that's, of course, important for the big tech companies. In the US, you see mostly a focus on economic value, whether or not you get property rights. As you know, the EU has adopted the data regulation already, went into effect in 2018, but it offers protection for personal data, data that where you can't trace the individual immediately. But we know also now, of course, that with industrial data, including location data, we can actually find a lot of information about individuals as well. But there's basically an artificial line drawn between for what type of data the harvesters need consent and others they don't need consent for. But even if they use data that have been consented for a particular purpose, if they use it later on for a different purpose, as long as it is legitimate to do so, it's also sanctioned by the regulation. So, you always have to look into the fine print of law to see what kind of rules and regulations exist and how far the rights go. Existing antitrust regimes also struggling with the use of with data and the data controllers. This might be changing. So I'm very proud to say that my colleague Tim Wu is going to the Council of Economic Advisors and is very interested in data control. Lina Khan, who has written this great paper as a student still at Yale Law School about Amazon's trust data paradox or antitrust, Amazon's antitrust paradox. She is nominated to be a commissioner at the FTC. So they might change that, but the current state of affairs is that trying to trace the market power of these data controllers has been difficult, because it has been difficult to define data as a product and use this definition of a product for what the market is. That's just how lawyers think, right? They have categories of thinking, they're fitting new things into that, and they're superimposing structures that were not made for them. And that, of course, opens a lot of space for arbitrage and for exploitation of gaps in the legal system. And I'll come back to this later. More generally, on the international level, because we have this very broad free trade regime, data controllers have been able to use that and take advantage of that by shifting their location and still using, of course, technology, computer clouds and things like that to access data of people elsewhere. As you know, there's also a big debate about taxation, and the OECD has pushed for a new kind of international tax regime whereby we can tax activities that reach consumers in our territories, even if there's no physical footprint. And of course, the big tech companies have exploited this notion. If you don't have a physical footprint, you won't be taxed. And so the technology forces now the law to catch up. And then last but not least, there are a number of ways in which we could think in the extraterritorial international sphere about data. I would just skip this for now because it would just be too much for a short presentation. So just a few more words about property law. So the law typically, again, classifies real property from personal or chattel property from intellectual property, and has certain markers for what would be a property right. So one reason is because you have economic value in it. Another, of course, normative foundation is the famous John Locke notion that if you combine your labor with an object, you should be able to get the fruits from that labor. But the way this is being used in current case law in the US in particular is to say, well, the data harvesters who have taken individual data, they put some labor into that because they clean it, they organize it, they throw computational power at it. We just emit data, right? We don't have really labor in them, and so we don't have a right to them, and they're not of economic value to us. There's some case law also for analog data compilation. So if you have a consumer list or other list that you have created, they were not protected by copyrights, but for using algorithms to do the same, patent offices have been more lenient and have granted copyrights. So this doesn't always make perfect sense, but you can see how, depending on the quality of the lawyer that you have, you might actually be able to classify a particular interest as a right that is deserving of a patent, and others are not. So I think Google's famous patent about sorting and organizing, basically filing data. A filing system was never granted a patent, but that one was, and that was quite valuable for Google. to start off. They are no longer as dependent on it now, of course. And then, of course, the right to privacy is something that also the common law protects. It's not an invention of the GDPR in Europe, but it protects it only for famous people because they have a monetary value in the pictures that are taken of them. But you and I are not sufficiently famous to claim that somebody cannot take a picture of us unless we give our approval to that. So there are interesting sort of lines drawn, and I think it's important to keep this in mind to see how big tech companies have also exploited these gaps in between. Just to just give you a metaphor in your own mind as you follow through this talk, I once talked to a client of a practicing lawyer with whom I teach, who got a degree from MIT in engineering, and he says he looks at the legal system, the accounting system, the tax system as overlaying systems, and you make money by exploiting the gaps between them. And the same is, of course, true for having new kinds of assets, potential assets like data. You're trying to characterize them such that you can get the best legal protection for them. Okay, I said most of this, what is on the slide here already. Basically, we have no general property rights protection for the data that you and I produce. In the paper, I talk about the fact that in Roman law, we had this concept of res nullius. So there are things that don't belong to anybody, but you can capture them. And once you have captured them, they are yours. So wild animals, you can shoot a wild animal, and once you have shot it, it's yours, even though in living form, it doesn't belong to anybody. There are also things that by convention and practice do not belong to anybody and can never belong to anybody. They're not appropriable, was the idea. But how to define that is, of course, the big question. Under Roman law, it was just understood that beaches and rivers and the air would not be ever appropriable by anybody. These are jus communis. And the major point I want to make here is that the ambiguity that property rights law left us with when we started the data harvesting project basically meant that the big companies could exploit this ambiguous zone by claiming data as wild animals. And once they had claimed them, they had shot the data and harvested them, it was theirs. And then they could use them and monetize them. There are also other weaknesses in the common law that you can exploit here, and there are differences in different legal systems, but under the common law, in principle, retailers do not owe duties to their customers, not even the duty to protect privacy. So they could, of course, create a list of their own consumers and even sell them. So if you don't specifically protect this and there's ambiguity in the law, then this is what happens. Sometimes, and that's kind of surprising to see, but you can also then see how the law develops, you get specific statutory provisions, such as the Video Privacy Protection Act, because there's a lobby that wants this specific law passed, and then you get it. But it's not a general protection of privacy or personhood or whatever you want to call it. It's just for this particular technology, when it captures you, it cannot do this unless you do X, Y, and Z. We get now in the US a little bit more general privacy protection. The California Consumer Privacy Act that went into force already in Vermont also has some kind of privacy protection, a little weaker than California, but it's sort of making its rounds in the US as well. So this picture I just want to use to describe how I view, or others view as well, sort of what people call like a kind of a two-sided market. I wouldn't necessarily call it a market. I think it's a very hierarchically structured exchange relations with a lot of data capture, like shooting of wild animals and then using them to sell them to others. So at the bottom here, you see what I call the data producers, you and I, whose information and behavior is being captured. We may or may not be identical with customers at the far end, so I just gave them a different name here. We have a relationship between the data producers and the platform. If we use a platform like Zoom or Facebook or Twitter or something, we agree to the terms of the platform. In fact, the data controllers or harvesters, they typically use standard form contracts. And when you click agree, you agree like the millions of others who are using it to the same standard form contract. So in this fashion, because the transaction cost of contracting have become so low in the information age, data controllers can create something that I call universality in the coding of capital. which I had linked to the state, because the state has coercive powers. It can make sure that everybody has to yield and accept the terms of a property right or of a corporation or trust that has been sanctioned by the law. But given the cheapness with which we can contract, data controllers can make us all agree to all kinds of contracts that none of us will ever have the time to read or understand, and thereby bind us to their particular platform. There's sort of new forms of universal control. So here, just I might have been slightly overblown the first sentence of my paper, but here you see sort of new forms of power and organizational capacity emerging using old forms of law. Standard contracts have been around for quite some time. So once you have access the platform and clicked agree, then the data controller can survey you and can harvest all kinds of data. Once these data are on a device, it can control it, can sell access to the data to different clients. That's how the data controller monetizes it, and the client in turn uses the predictive power of the data to have targeted ads or to manipulate behavior in one way or another. Now, in this slide, I'm just complicating it a little bit, and I'm telling you where we have legal protection and where we have explicitly no legal protection. Just to show you again, so if you think about the scaffolding and the gaps that you are exploiting for creating this kind of arrangement, you can see here are the stop signs. So the data producers are hardly, if at all, protected. You know, sort of the protection even in the EU came decades into the harvesting project. So we have some control, you know, to exclude personal data, but other than that, very little protection, no property rights protection. We then have, again, go back to the relationship to the data controller, platform access. We're just assuming full private autonomy, equal power of the contracting parties. That's all the implicit assumptions that underlie our contract law. And we have failed to use antitrust law to make sure that there was not a one-sided exploitation of bargaining power here. Once the data are on the device, I said this before, they will be protected against hacking. Also increasingly since the early 2000s in the US in particular, we're using trade secrecy law. So you might not be able to patent all that, but you can claim trade secrecy law as long as you were able to keep the stuff secret with your technology. If others then try to steal it, it's going to be considered as a theft again. So this is sanctioned by the state. So that's also a benefit that they get. In the surveillance then of the data producers in this big loop here, we have no privacy protection, I said before, because most of that has to be signed off. With the limitation that maybe the GDPR or the new California law might impose. And so there's a free hunting ground for the data controllers. In the relationship between them and their own clients, they basically have now created quasi-property rights because they have put the data on the device, they have the computational power, they grant access to the same data, maybe using different algorithms to different types of clients who pay for that. So this is how you monetize this relationship. And then last but not least, the clients in relationship to the customers can rely on contractual relations or at least on free speech. So free speech also protects in the US for sure commercial speech. Can't blatantly lie, but short of that, you can tell all kinds of stories that will be protected and cannot be challenged. Okay, so what does that mean basically for data governance? So first of all, of course, you have to say, is there something wrong here? And I recently gave the paper that I sent you at Chicago Law School, and the question I got is, what is wrong here? These guys have are very ingenious, very inventive. They're finding ways to also make our lives easier because they can predict what we want and they can provide us with these services. Everything's much easier since I can use Google Maps and all these other services. So you might think there's nothing wrong here. I happen to think that there's something wrong here because my real concern is the increasing use of data to predict the behavior of both individuals and groups and try to influence them in a massive way. Now, again, I think we've seen this before with propaganda and other means. I think the predictive power and the targeted interventions that can be made today are more frightening. And then, of course, also the use of data from us, treating the data that we have as free animals for the free consumption of the data controllers and their clients without any of the data producers participating in the economic gains, I do find problematic as well. So the question then, when you think about reforming this governance structure, is sort of what is the best point of entry, right? So one thing that has been debated a lot is whether you strengthen the individual property rights of the data producers and whether this would make a difference. Whose interests should really be protected? The data producers, the consumers, the clients, the harvesters, against whom? So how do you prioritize the different rights? What legal forms are available? I mentioned before that legal forms have been around for quite some time. They don't always fit very well the new developments, but they can also be refashioned a little bit. So in my book, I describe how the 6 core institutions that have been used for coding capital have been used, most of them for 500 years. Some bankruptcies a little later, corporation in this particular incarnation, only 200 and some years. But the basic forms have been around for a while and have been repurposed for different assets. So we can also tweak existing forms and maybe also can think a little bit more imaginatively about future forms. And so that's the real challenge, is how can they be repurposed for data governance? And of course, at the same time, we have to think about the advances that technology is making. And technology can both undermine the legal structures that we're trying to impose, but could also help. So there are at the frontier a lot of new, privacy protecting keys are developed where people could have greater control over the kind of data that are harvestable without their consent. You could create them in such a way that they make a commitment and can't back out from this commitment again for many years or under only under certain conditions. So you don't just sign this off because you find one particular data platform or digital platform so particularly attractive. So there are ways that people are talking about this, but I think that really requires much more investigation, certainly on my part and my co-author's part. So where do we control? My suggestion in the paper, and it's just one way to think about this, I'll show you other ways in a second, is to say, let's just move beyond the to start with the data controller, because that's really where the economic value is being made, and where at the aggregate level, the use of data as a means of control is really becoming apparent. So that's what my focus is here, to think about how can we control the aggregate data or govern aggregate data at this level, and how can we make sure that we actually draw a bigger circle and bring in the data producers themselves. So that, to me, means we want to use organizational tools rather than only bilateral contractual tools or hierarchical property rights. So I'm thinking about organizational forms here. And the suggestion I make is not a universal model for all kinds of data, but I'm basically saying, given where we are right now, with big tech companies already having accumulated a lot of data, let's sort of create private trusts that govern the use of the data and also make sure that economic benefits flow back to the data producers. So where before you saw basically the data controller, I'm basically saying this is a vehicle, a legal shell, a trust, where all the data are being aggregated. The producers are all stakeholders in this trust, and they should get some pro rata share in the economic benefits of the aggregate data. So rather than selling their individual data points for which they never get any money, we know that Facebook is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Now divided by 2.5 billion users is also not that much per person, but it's certainly more than if we sell our individual data points at ex ante. So I think we should have a stake in the future value of the corporation as shareholders do, or the beneficiaries, the investors in trust do. And so this is the model I use here. How this data will be used and what decisions will be made over it will be decided by a trustee. So you always need some kind of an agent, and a trustee is basically bound by a particular trust document. It's not really a governance structure like the board of directors in a corporation makes decisions about the future of the corporation at the same time as a trustee for the shareholders. In a trust arrangement, you basically bind the hands of the trustee much closer to a particular purpose, and then say you have to manage these assets in the interest of these producers. And all the other services that are typically associated with what big tech companies do are basically farmed out. You just have contractual relationships here. So aggregating cleaning services, service providers, the clients, etc., that could be farmed out. And then, of course, you may have to make sure that the contracts between the trustee and the clients are in conformity with the basic trust deed that sets this up. So it's just one idea. I don't want to oversell it. I know that, some people have picked it up in the news as well as a possible use of data. It, of course, would make a huge change, because you basically would say, okay, Facebook can still exist as a corporation, but all the data that Facebook has have to go into this trust and have to be governed by a separate trust arrangement, and the fees or returns that Facebook get have to be reduced by whatever the producers might be getting here as well. Now, let me just say a few more words, and then I will stop in general about other legal forms that we can think about. I think one thing we already have to be aware of is that our classic forms of property rights, hierarchical rights that rank different interests to the same kind of goods or interests or resources, are already being upended by new technology. So when you buy a Kindle book on Amazon, you have not unlimited right to lend it to your neighbors and to your friends, and you can also lose it again because they might delete it, and you can't use it on a different electronic reader. So you don't really buy a book, you buy sort of access rights over a certain period of time on a particular form. So this is already all happening, and I think the private parties are always ahead of the game. They are reinventing property rights in a contractual fashion, and I'm just trying to harness similar imagination and power for thinking about governance in a more socially acceptable or desirable fashion. When it comes to contracts, I think we have in our original legal system some limitations on contracts. So you can't freely sell your organs. That's just not allowed. So we do limit contractual freedom in certain important ways. And another important principle of contract law is that you can't enter into contracts that impose a burden on others. So how can I actually sell access to information of my friends in Facebook? In principle, you should not be able to do so, but somehow this has been made possible. So if you look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, much of the information that was harvested was not the Facebook users as such, but also their friends. And one of the questions was whether they really agreed to that, but I would even go a step further and ask, would they have the power to agree that the information of their friends who are not on Facebook can be harvested by Facebook and then be sold by others? That's always a question of how to enforce, how to monitor and enforce, but I just want to put the principles here on the table. Contracts, of course, and this is where the EU is and is pushing further, is not only privacy, but also portability. I can take my data from one entity to another, and the right to be forgotten is also an important one that sort of speaks to the limited durability of rights that people can have to my data. I might also be able to say this is it, and again, how to enforce this is important. When we think about organizational forms, sort of in a similar way in which I just discussed the private trust, there are some voices, Balkan in particular, for a couple of years ago, suggested that we should treat Facebook already as data fiduciaries. So they are for-profit corporations, but by having harvested all our data, we also should treat them as fiduciaries and impose obligations to use the data in the interest of their principals whom they serve. And there has been some debate about this. My colleagues, Lina Khan and David Posen, have critiqued the model, but there's still something there I think that one could exploit. Aziz Hook at Chicago Law School recently wrote a paper, which I think is now on ssrn.com, it's not published yet, on using public trust. So he suggests that all locational data should be captured by trust at the municipal level. So he's nervous about large trusts, state-controlled or publicly owned trusts at the federal level, but at the municipal level, they could have all the location data. And then again, you would have to, farm out the cleaning, the organization, and somehow find ways to fund this. But that is another avenue in which people are thinking. I just introduced it to private trust. I think one can push this further. We have a long tradition of mutuals, of cooperatives. You could think about data mutuals and think about how to design that. And then just the last point I want to get to, as I mentioned earlier, I think we do have a fair chance now, depending on who's really going to be in the FTC and the DOJ in this country, that there might be antitrust and more serious antitrust measures taken against the big tech companies. Now, I think that's only the first step, because it doesn't resolve the governance issue, right? We know from past antitrust interventions such as AT&T, that the small bells are all coming back and reorganizing themselves. And so at most, this gives us some breathing space, I think, to think about these alternative governance structures, and we have to think much harder about them, especially if we do get the chance of this breathing space. So let me stop here and stop sharing and take your questions. Thanks for listening.
Wow, Katharina, that was fantastic, amazing, and quite a tour de force. I mean, really, the huge and very, very comprehensive survey of this. And I know there are going to be lots of questions. I mean, I have some of my own, but I'm going to wait for people. I'm going to allow people who have questions to raise them. If you want to raise your hand in the chat, or write stack in the chat, or just speak. Okay, I'm not seeing any question immediately, so can I then, oh, sorry, Sam, please go ahead. Yeah, you have to unmute, Sam.
This is really just a footnote, and you probably know this, Katharina, but Kenneth Arrow in 1971 has a wonderful passage in which he says, information is a fugitive resource. What is fugitive resource? It's like an animal that runs away. And it's a fantastic passage, because what he says is it can't be owned. Now, Ugo in the chat, this is a conversation Ugo and I've been having for the last 25 years. Ugo, so please join in. Ugo in the chat asked you a question and saying, but look, the animal who's wild in the free is a rival good. In some of the work that I have done about hunters and gatherers, I've made the point that Ugo accepts, which is very often you have such a large animal, you couldn't possibly use it yourself. So it isn't rival. But Ugo's point is quite right. The stuff is rival, or it can be, it may or may not be rival. But in any case, the passage from Arrow is exactly what the Roman law thing that you're talking about is. The stuff is wild there. And what he goes on to say, the very next sentence, he says, the way that knowledge is accumulating will force us to change our institutions about this problem, which is exactly Marx talking about the advance of the forces of production, forcing a change in the social relations of production. And I asked Arrow, was that what he intended? He said, of course, that's what I intended. That's exactly, and that was 1971. Isn't that wonderful? But look it up.
That is wonderful. Yeah, I will look it up. I will look it up. Great, wonderful. And just a note, this is where I started talking with my colleague 3 years ago, because he says, it's not scarce, it's not rivalrous. So all the economic sort of concepts that people use don't really fit, and neither do the legal concepts. So it's basically a major leap it's just an ingenuity, I think, of creating the appearance as if this could be treated as just another oil and can be captured, and then it will be captured. Now, also, I think the scale of data collection and harvesting and just saving the data is just huge, right? Maybe up to 5% at most of all data are currently being analyzed. But these big data farms are using them, I think, to create artificial technological monopolies over something that should not be treated as a rivalrous good.
I wonder if Ugo wants to come in on that as well. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. And it's true that with Sam, we have been discussing this thing for ages, because he was saying that there are these ideas that, in fact, are free as giraffes. And my point was that they can be bred like cows eventually. So it's a problem from this point of view. But sure, data, I believe, that are not rival goods. So from this point of view, they are a form of knowledge. And in fact, I've still got problems, in treating the issue of knowledge, property rights on knowledge and data separately. Why I think that, however, you have a good point to treat them separately. Because if you take the knowledge about, say, vaccine, okay, that is also non-rival, okay, but it's a different thing. The only problem is whether you should give incentives to people. I don't believe that, but I think that it should be treated as a common. But okay, there is this type of argument there. Then take the data about Hugo, not about the vaccine. Okay, also that is a non-rival good. Okay, the fact that you use, the data about Hugo does not prevent Sam to use the data about Hugo. So it's again. However, although it's a non-rival good, there is an issue that we want to have some privacy. Okay, so we feel that although it is a non-rival good, and this is the point of John Stuart Mill, there should be an area of privacy in spite of this being potentially a non-rival good. So you get attention here from both sides, because on the one hand, you have a question of privacy, okay? And on the other hand, it's not a private, technical, it's not a private good, but it's a non-rival good, okay? So you have got, so you take the standard theory of knowledge, add the problem of privacy, and then you get the problem of data. But the only meaningful addition in comparison to other forms of knowledge that you have in the problem of data is when data become personal data. Because of course you get vaccine, data also about vaccine, about nature, about other things. So from this point of view, it's the same issue of knowledge in general. It's not any different. The only thing that there is this area of knowledge that using a people can put a wall around it because it's concerning themselves, so that you get the problem on both sides. That's how I see it.
So I think, I think it's an important point. I'm always wondering though where the boundary of privacy is, and that's of course more blurred than clear, because with modern technologies and also new psychological research, we can basically use data about relations, social relations, right? That's what also the Cambridge Analytica was all about, that you have connections with others, and from that construct who you are and what you do without you ever having given any consent, and then use that to target your behavior or the group's behavior. So, is basically are my connections, the 350 friends that the average Facebook user has with others, are my connections with others private data, or is this widely available data? So I think there is, I think the technology itself has so much power and can be used to exert power over others, that I'd like to have that basically in the realm of what we want to govern, not only my intimate privacy, but a broader range of usages of data, even if there are, just relatively neutral data. I just go to my office every day, but that says with whom I have connections, etc.
Okay, there's a question from Nirupama. Nirupama, can you unmute and can you open your video if possible?
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Jayati. Thank you, Katharina. It's a very illuminating presentation. I work on privacy engineering, so I have a question actually. In my view, data ownership entitles, how my data is being used, harvested, sold, and it should be traceable. The next point is based on, who is getting profit out of my data. Should I not be like, get a payback? And I have a third point is, what about the use of citizens' data by the government? Like, how the law should be devised such a way that governments don't have full-blown access to citizens' data. So your thoughts, please.
Yeah. So on the first point, should I be able to control my data? Whether they can be harvested at all? So if I go on a computer, whether they can be harvested at all? I would say yes. I'm just not sure whether it's enough. because this goes back to the economic exploitation. So many people will just sign off their data for nothing because they want to access a particular platform, or they can, even the pittance that they might get for it is enough. So I'm just not sure that the transactional relationship between a data harvester and, even with new technology that can protect privacy better than it currently does, whether this should be necessarily the end of the governance structure, but it's certainly an important beginning. I'm just saying that we probably need technology to do this, because the case law in the US currently says, because these data are not worth anything, they're even challenging litigants to say, well, have you ever tried to sell your data? Has anybody ever given you some money for it? And the answer to that is typically no, or nothing of real value. So then it can't be a property right. Now, this is maybe an extreme position, but that's the way the common law here has evolved. And the third point on the government, I think there is an interesting, in general, there are restrictions on what governments can do. They have to respect our privacy rights in principle, right? We know, of course, all the revelations by Ed Snowden and others about NSA not doing that. We also know that the government is increasingly trying to cooperate with or twist the arms of big tech companies and others so they can access their information. So to the extent that big tech companies have information over us and they can get it easier than any government ever could, but the government can leverage its power over these companies, they might actually get more information about us than they've ever had before. So I think that's a real vulnerability. It's both the government directly surveying, but also surveying with the help of digital companies. And you see that's in the negotiation between big tech companies and in China with the government and other places where they cave in and don't show certain things or allow governments to do their own surveillance as well.
Thank you.
Could I add to that question, Katharina? How would you control that? That seems to be one of those insoluble things. How would you actually control the surveillance of government? Because the things you're suggesting, like the private trusts and so on, those will not solve that problem, will they?
No, but I think, I think one of the goals in my own thinking is to decentralize and, maybe if you want, democratize governance. And so the data would be much more diffuse. There's actually no reason in my mind, really, that we have these huge data farms all up there. And, people are always talking about scale effects, but for what purposes, really, right? So if we have limited amounts of data that are available at a certain place, and they have been used for certain purposes, then the government certainly would also have more checks or more tripwires, not really checks and balances, more tripwires and difficulties in accessing them rather than going through the big tech companies. But it's something it's really hard. It's also a hard issue because I think there is some legitimate surveillance that governments do, right? There's also some criminal law enforcement that governments do. And so they would want to have, the phone record. And in the old days, they could just get this for hard lines as well. But we don't want to flip this into something where we have complete surveillance. We have the same thing with contact tracing and COVID, right? The extent to which, for health purposes, we're now creating a complete surveillance systems, and can we ever get out of this again? I think here again, there's probably more sophisticated technology out there than has been used, and the companies that are advising the OECD or the EU or the US are typically the bigger companies that also are in the game of monetizing our data. My understanding, against conversation with technologists, I'm not a technologist myself, is that there's more available. And I think one of the missions I would have is that to push the technologists to offer more alternatives and to push people who talk about governance and politics, etc., to open the doors on the government side to more interactions with alternative ways that protect privacy better than what we currently have, while still having meaningful public health impact as well.
Okay, just sorry to abuse my position, but in India, there's a big discussion about whether you can have local servers or servers abroad. What's the big issue in that? Is that the kind of thing you were suggesting in decentralizing the data? Is that why would it be such a concern that the server is somewhere else?
Well, I think there has been a debate. I think ever since it came out that NSA was surveying Chancellor Merkel's telephone, right? So where are the data located so that local law can apply to them? So it's basically an attempt for the government to say, we want to be able to control the conditions under which certain data are being used or not used, and we don't want them to just flow out and we don't have any access to them. So it's a kind of territorial-based control, which is a little naive, I think, in the age of data, where much of the stuff is so fluid anyhow. But that seems to be the impetus behind these measures.
Who has more questions? Because I had one more, but I don't. I think Michael has a question. Yes, go ahead, Michael.
I think there's a stack in the chat.
I think Pedro was first.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. My apologies. I don't know why this was not showing in my. Okay, sorry about this. Yes, Pedro, please. Apologies. And then Juan Camilo, and then Isabella. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Pistor. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the public algorithm solution, if you will, because I know you've been talking a lot about the trust fund, and I mean, the way I see it, these are kind of like market solutions, but the real source of power for a digital platform that can amass this grand amount of data is the algorithm that they can train from this data, right? So what do you see as maybe like let's say the weakest link in this argument of a publicly owned algorithm, right? Now, I don't mean like specifically like, okay, let the government own it then, right? But let's use the technology in favor of the original data producers, which is the language that we are already using anyway.
Yeah, no, you're pointing to a weakness in all kinds of agency relations. So you're writing a contract or you're writing a charter and you commit to a particular purpose, and then the question is, can we repurpose this, or can we decide that this still falls within that purpose? And that's where all the arbitrage activities are going to go. I don't think you can prevent that at all. I think you can only, write relatively tight contracts or appoint trustees that are vigilant. And I think one of the just disadvantages of the trust in particular, I want to point out, is that you hold it to the original charter, but you can't really break the original deed. And in a world that is so flexible and fast moving as the digital world, this might be a huge cost. So you have to think about renegotiations and adaptations and who has power over that. I kind of like sort of the basic idea of a trust model, because my hope would also be that agents of the data producers themselves might have some more sophisticated understanding of algorithms and how they could be used and what the cost and benefits are. But I think you have to, you would have to write contracts and build into them some control and some liability for abuse, and some regular reviews to make sure that this is not overexploited. But you see this everywhere you look in agency relationships, that there are limitations of what you can do in terms of protecting the original purpose, especially when you have such an asymmetry of sophistication over the algorithm and the ability to control it. Clearly an issue. Again, I would want to have technologists also participate and say, what could you do, right? Sort of with blockchain technology, can you commit certain kind of control devices that are sort of immutable, as immutable as blockchain or similar technologies can be? Can we actually do better with the help of technology than we do currently with just the law?
Okay, Juan Camilo. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Katharina, for this very stimulating talk. So I am asking you the following, starting from the basic principal agent problem of information asymmetry. And I'm particularly thinking of citizens who have particular genetic conditions and particular behavioral attitudes and actions. And these are private information that could be exploited, harvested, produced, and shared, and accumulated. And I'm thinking there are at least 4 huge sectors in the economy: the pharmaceutical industry, who is interested in knowing the genetics of each particular person for tailoring medicine; and the medical care industry, who would like to see also certain behaviors of people so that they can either prevent or address certain behaviors of people regarding their health, the insurance industry, who would be interested in personalizing premiums to each particular person, how well or bad you drive, or how much you drunk and drive, and so on. And the financial sector, who would be interested in personalizing interest rates for business people. So those four sectors, pharmaceutical, medical, insurance, and financial, are huge in the economy. And someone could argue that this could be efficiency enhancing. If you reduce these asymmetries of information, someone could claim that there are gains from giving this information to these companies. But of course, this bothers us a lot. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on these particular cases, or in general, these cases.
Yeah, no, I think this is also a debate that has been going on for quite some time. So you can basically optimize along certain dimensions, and at the same time say this is just normatively repugnant. So I'm just thinking about Skinner, right? Who said we can basically condition everybody on not committing any crimes. We just condition you, but is this still a free society kind of thing? You can also say we can optimize your health regime if we just disclose all the data that we have, and then you're basically led through your life, but you lack individual self-authorship. So normatively, I think what this tells us that we have to have a normative debate. It's just not only about efficiency. It's never been just about efficiency, right? And I think increasingly people are waking up to that. We have a normative debate about the society we want to have and the kind of freedoms that we want to grant people, whether or not we truly have on some kind of biological basis the freedom to decide. I still hold on to this notion of self-authorship over one's lives and the ability to advance that. So having said that, I think in an ideal world, I would like to have some privacy keys that allow people to say, yes, I will share my health data, but only for aggregate public health stuff, or I have a particular rare disease and I want to make sure that the geneticists can find the causes and maybe treat others if they can't treat me. But I want to be able to carve that out and limit all the other uses. And I think we have to have basically walls erected through legislation and monitoring that other types of companies do not have access to certain types of data. So what kind of information should financial companies have about you when they make decisions about your credit scores? I think that's something for a public normative debate. Now, again, enforcement is an issue, and the algorithms will do all kinds of things, and they will find leaks to find something else. But just drawing boundaries here, I think, is critically important. And in my mind, the decision should be depending on the kind of data, individual decisions and also collective decisions, right? There might be family issues. So if I go and have my own DNA decoded, then the rest of the family will find out too whether they have a certain disease, and that's something where maybe they have to have a veto right over certain type of decisions. But it's ultimately, I think, a normative decision, and we have to find ways to make sure that we can make these decisions and don't assume them away by just saying, well, it's efficient, that's fine.
Thank you.
I think Isabella has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I was particularly intrigued by the idea that the regulations that we use go back to Roman law, to such a different period in so many ways. And I was wondering, so I kind of heard in the discussion that the Chinese case might be seen as some kind of an extreme case where the things that we have here could be developing into. But in China, of course, we have a very different kind of property arrangement, very different legal tradition, very different state-market relations that are subject to an explicitly different historical tradition that is also reaching back quite far. So I'm wondering to what extent the Chinese case really is what this is developing into, or whether these very different legal landscapes when it comes to the question of property rights in particular wouldn't lead to a very different dynamic.
I think it's a really interesting question. But I do think that the big tech companies here in the West have already made property rights much more fluid than we thought them to be, right? So we have organized most of our thinking about property rights around land, a really tangible asset, and have fortified individual rights to the land, and we've ranked them, etc., and protected them against the state, but also found protection from the state to protect them against others, or use the power generated from control over land and other assets to govern other people. In China, this has been somewhat differently, but I think in this data world, sort of the lines are no longer that clear. And And I would argue that, the kind of things that Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies do in terms of using our data and directing behavior is not fundamentally different. So I think the data companies certainly in this country have to use they use the power of the law that we have, and they employ it for their own ends. They are corporations, right? They use dual share structures. They do all kinds of things to maintain control inside these companies. In China, they don't have quite as much leeway. So we saw this with the Ant IPO that was called up in the fall, right? So that at some point the Chinese government says, no, you can't do this. So it's much more state control over things. And I think in China, the real threat is sort of the overarching state control through companies that have some moderate leeway to do things, but they orchestrate this in the end, and they control it and can call the plug. I think it's interesting also to see in the payment systems in China that they basically pulled them up, right? So WeChat payment systems started at a more decentralized level, and at some point China made sure that all the stuff goes through the central bank, so there's government control over that. We might see something similar here. I think one could also see a more democratic version of that if everybody had a wallet with a central bank, and similar in digital power. So I think this information technology age opens all kinds of more fluid organizations of governance that I think make the difference between China and the US perhaps less stark, even though we've played still with these images. But I think it's really about organizational governance, and that's something that China has done also for millennia, right? So they also organized the code, and they had magistrates everywhere, and they interpreted the code in a certain way. And it started more decentralized in the West, but it's getting to a similar level. I don't see really what the difference between Mark Zuckerberg and President Xi is necessarily. It's, at that level. Not quite there yet, but
fascinating answer, Katharina. I have to really think about that one. Okay, and Michael? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That was a terrific and thought-provoking talk. And I share your anxiety about the collection and use of the data. But I want to offer a couple of thoughts, and maybe you can just respond on this, not exactly a question. The first is that individual consumers or households seem to have a very low willingness to pay for these services. If you told someone they had to pay $5 a year for Facebook, I bet a lot of people wouldn't. So there's something about free as the price that makes it possible to exploit people. I think it makes it very difficult, the idea of putting together kind of a consumers union version of this, where we'd all pay a little and get something nicer out of it. That's first. Related is television and radio are strictly one way. They don't have the quality of sucking up and sending back. But we already have kind of, I don't know, where we had 100 years of radio, more or less. And, vast wasteland, I think we already had sort of one round of, you didn't have to pay anything, but you got something really crummy. You got shoved at you all the time telling you buy, buy, buy. That's the second. And then the third is, I'm kind of curious about the value of the data, because I know that people spend these giant amounts of money for, and you hear tales of things like Cambridge Analytica. You can only buy so much stuff. And I'm just kind of curious, is there evidence that people are being marketed to more effectively? That, they really know what, they know how to sell me, cigarettes or, whatever wine better than they did on the pages of a glossy magazine. I mean, I'm not that interesting. I'm just like the person next to me and the person next to me. So what's so great about knowing I'm special?
Yeah,
that's all.
Let me start on the last point, and I might ask you to remind me of the others. But the last one, I recently read an article, and you might have seen this too in the news, that during COVID pandemic, many companies were cutting back expenses and were paying much less for and were serving far fewer, and the results were the same. So they I think, realizing slowly that exactly what you said, not every individual person on certain things is so interesting. So I think there has been a certain hype, which also the big tech companies have been able to exploit. And I think also sort of this posture of, we have all the data and you can throw all kinds of computational power at them. Well, is that really worth it for just selling another pair of shoes or something along those lines? So I think we're learning more as we go how important this targeted advertisement really is. I think there's also still open question about whether Cambridge Analytica really had a real impact on the US elections. They certainly tried, but I'm not sure we have hard evidence that they did. I'm not sure we should continue to try. So there is sort of a danger that we want to sort of maybe cap before we have full evidence that we can do it. But there's certainly clear that you have influenced voting behavior. And that I think is for me enough. Whether it's enough of enough people, it's a different story. So I think it depends on which purposes, but yeah, I think the full value is not clear yet, and they have certainly overpaid for years, and that might also adjust over time. Just coming back to the first question that you asked about sort of consumer labor unions, I mean, the model that I describe is sort of saying it's not that they all of a sudden have to pay, but they still get free services, but they get a share in the aggregate value of that, and you deduct the cost of cleaning them and maintaining them and right? So I agree, sort of the payment function is a difficult one, and people are signing off also for almost nothing because they want to have free access. But the other thing I just throw in is that the German cartel office has fined Facebook for uncompetitive behavior, basically lying about that people get something for free, because they don't. You take something away. And we were basically given the impression that you always get something for free. And there's a long tradition of anti-competitive law that basically says you can't make these kind of pretenses if you grab something at the back end, and that's what they did at Facebook. So again, if regulators had been a little bit more aggressive, maybe we could have also prevented some of that more effectively. The question is now where this is going to go at the EU level or elsewhere. Now you have to remind me of your middle question that escapes me.
It was related. It was lessons from the television and radio, the one-way medium as opposed to the two-way.
I fully agree, and I think sort of this interactive, and also not only the interact we with the platform, but we with others of the platform. So the real power, and I think the qualitative difference today is sort of capturing social relations and using group influence, not only individual influence, and that especially for democracies and democratic self-governance and things like that, I think that's really concerning.
Thanks so much. That's wonderful.
There's a question from Aaron Medin about your trusts idea. So Aaron, would you go ahead? Hello?
Hello.
Oh yeah, there you are.
This was a very fascinating presentation, Professor Pistor. I'm enormously interested in it. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little more on your trust proposal. Are we talking about like a single kind of maybe quasi-government entity that is kind of managing this, or should they be spread out across like a number of different trusts? Like how concentrated should this be? And do we have different trusts for different forms of data that we might care about protecting?
Yeah, so I'm not thinking about a single big trust or a single that's a government-sponsored entity or something that manages them. I'm thinking more decentralized. So in the model that I present in the paper, I'm mostly thinking taking the big tech company as they are currently, or we break them up and they're a little smaller. You take Instagram or Facebook and you structure a trust relationship with it, basically saying all the data that you're harvesting will be managed by this trust according to a trust deed that is part of the governance arrangement. And then again, some of the aggregate value can go back to those Facebook users. So we basically have a relatively decentralized, but it's sort of purposeful and multiple trusts that are attached to certain users. Now, if we built this from scratch, if we didn't start with Facebook, etc., then you can start thinking along Aziz Hook's idea, saying maybe all locational data should be harvested at the municipal level, right? So that would be maybe meaningful. But once you talk about social media network platforms that are global, it's just the municipal data collection doesn't really fit. But the beauty of something like the trust, it's not bounded by territory, right? You just have basically a legal shell, like clouds. They reside somewhere in the abstract world, and you just have to allocate sort of control rights and remuneration rights and things like that, and powers to it.
Okay, have I missed out anyone? Is there anybody who would like to ask a final question? Okay, Gregor, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My question is a little bit along the lines of Juan Camilo's, and perhaps with a specific bent towards data that's generated by companies and whether we have to worry about the governance of those too. I'm coming from the field of climate change mitigation, and there's a lot of talk about, oh, if we have smart heating systems in our houses, we can save a little bit of energy, but it also, shared cars that drive around smartly and pick people up where they're needed, reduces a lot of emissions and car manufacturing emissions. But it also extends to the company level. And even now, there are systems in place that switch off cooling in supermarkets for a few minutes, in order to balance supply and demand of electricity, and thereby, overall make the system more efficient. But also importantly, to, carbon emissions disclosure of companies to reduce carbon transition risks to a low carbon world, and companies that are very carbon intensive, may pose a problem to the financial system. And there, the narrative to me seems to be all about, let's increase transparency. We need, more open data out there. And to me, it seems like this is pretty unconnected and we don't need to be concerned. But I was really curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think in finance, since the 1930s, we have relied on disclosure as sort of the regulatory means, which is a soft touch regulatory regime saying just disclose everything and then rational investors will make their decisions. Yeah. And I don't think it works for everything. We also know that lots of investors, don't take in the information, or the market movers know it more anyhow, but they take advantage of the freely disclosed information. I think in the climate change area in particular, we have a lot of greenwashing, of course, as you know, and we have a lot of, it's not clear that any investor will respond to any disclosure of information because investors benefit from limited liability. They have multiple legal shields that even if a company has a bad carbon footprint, until it catches up with investors, they have long left and exited their position. So I just don't believe that this is sufficient to address climate change. On the general note, I think there's nothing wrong with using the information technology capacities that we have to monitor better what people are doing and to find out whether you can reduce your temperature or something and to reduce maybe climate footprints. The question is, we could then have a debate about how much privacy people have to sacrifice to make that possible, at what level, right? And again, how much can they, in doing so, also impose obligations on others? And I think these are sort of standard legal questions, but they have deeper normative implications. But I would, in general, say disclosure in the climate stuff is not enough. Disclosure also in very complex matters as these ones. I use your data for all kinds of things. We sign off. It's just not enough. It's just it's a fig leaf. It doesn't really address the underlying problems, I believe. And so we need different forms of governance. It's the idea is sort of self-governance by the market, and you just disclose, and then the rational actors are doing it. It works for certain things, but it's limited.
That's so true. And of course, this trust idea is a very innovative thing. I have to think about it more, but what a fascinating talk, Katharina. This has really brought out so many issues and suggested so many different directions of thinking. And I'm amazed that you managed to cover so much in this time. Also, thank you for the patience with which you have answered all these questions. So it's really been amazing. It's terrific to have you.
Thank you. Thanks you all for all your questions and for having me. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Cheers.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful
Thanks,
afternoon.
Everyone. Thanks for joining.
Stay safe.